It is approximately the year 615 CE in Mecca. The early Muslims are facing intense persecution from the ruling Quraysh tribe. Amidst this tension, the Prophet Muhammad stands in the precincts of the Kaaba, reciting Surah An-Najm, the 53rd chapter of the Quran. According to a highly scrutinized historical claim, as the Prophet reached the verses mentioning the pagan deities Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, he yielded to an intense internal desire for reconciliation with his people. The story alleges he recited an interpolation. These are the exalted Gharaniq, whose intercession is hoped for, praising the very idols the Quran sought to dismantle. The narrative dictates that the Quraysh were thrilled by this apparent theological concession. When the chapter ended with a command to bow, both the monotheistic Muslims and the polytheistic pagans dropped to the ground, united in a sudden, false reconciliation. This incident, known in Islamic literature as Qissat al-Gharaniq, presents a severe paradox. It survives today because it was physically recorded in some of the most foundational compilations of early Islamic history, including the works of Al-Tabari and Ibn Sa'd. Yet for 14 centuries, classical Sunni Orthodox scholarship has categorized the event as an absolute fabrication. They achieved this not by ignoring the early texts, but by subjecting them to a strict, multi-layered scientific filtration system. The rejection of this narrative relies on a framework of epistemological deduction, a methodology that modern secular historians frequently overlook when analyzing these early sources. Modern observers often look at ancient records and assume that if a renowned historian included a story, they must have validated its truth. Applying this modern standard to 9th century Islamic texts is a critical error in understanding how those authors actually worked. Early Islamic scholars like Al-Tabari did not operate as historical filters. Their academic mandate was preservation. They were encyclopedists and exhaustive data collectors, systematically gathering every oral tradition, rumor, and historical fragment circulating across the empire, regardless of its integrity. To maintain transparency, these compilers attached an isnad, a chain of transmission, to every report. By providing the exact names of the transmitters, the compiler delegated the burden of authentication to later specialists in Hadith science. Al-Tabari explicitly detailed this methodology in his introduction. He wrote that if a reader finds anything detestable in his book, it is not my fault, but the fault of the one who transmitted it to me. I have merely reported it as it was reported to me. Citing Al-Tabari to validate the Gharaniq story misses the author's own intent. His text was the starting line for investigation, never the final verdict. Before classical scholars even looked at who transmitted a story, they applied a primary filter, testing the text itself for compatibility with the internal mechanics of Islamic doctrine. In Orthodox Islam, this filter is known as Ismah. It is the doctrine of absolute divine protection. It dictates that all prophets are divinely protected from error, omission, or satanic interference, specifically in the reception and transmission of wahi, divine revelation. The implication of the Quranic narrative is absolute. If Satan successfully hijacked the prophet's cognitive faculties to insert pagan praises into a monotheistic text, the certainty of the entire Quranic corpus is compromised. A messenger vulnerable to satanic dictation cannot be trusted to deliver an incorruptible message. Proponents of the myth often point to Surah 22, verse 52, which mentions Satan throwing something into the recitation of prophets. However, classical exegesis clarifies that this refers to a distortion of the audience's perception. Satan whispers doubts and noise into the ears of the listeners, not onto the tongue of the prophet. Because the claim of an interpolated verse contradicts explicit Quranic guarantees of textual purity, Islamic theologians classified the event as an impossibility before the historical chains were even evaluated. While theology rejects the content, the historical resolution lies within Usoul al-Hadith, the Islamic science of network analysis and biographical evaluation known as Ilm al-Rijal. When Hadith masters mapped out every existing chain of transmission for the Gharaniq story, they found that every single path leading back to the Prophet suffers from structural flaws. The primary flaw is that these chains are Mursal, or disconnected. None of the men reporting the event were alive or present as eyewitnesses when it occurred in Mecca. This missing link between the narrator and the source invalidates the report. Beyond the missing eyewitnesses, the surviving branches are populated by compromised nodes. The most prolific promoter of the story was the early chronicler Al-Waqidi. The masters of Hadith evaluated Al-Waqidi and formally classified him as a fabricator. His node was stamped matruk, abandoned, rendering his entire branch of the historical record void. A minor internal debate arose when the 15th century scholar Ibn Hajar theorized that because there were so many of these weak chains, they might aggregate to form a historical baseline of truth. But later Hadith specialists dismantled this theory, using the strict rules of their own science. In matters of foundational theology, adding multiple broken chains populated by known fabricators still equals zero. Under the microscope of network science, the narrative is devoid of an authentic, continuous historical origin. Despite classical scholars solving this issue centuries ago, many Western Orientalist scholars continue to validate the myth. Since the 19th century, secular academia has consistently revived the narrative, fueling modern controversies that reach far beyond the classroom. To defend the story, modern secular historians lean on the criterion of embarrassment. This is the assumption that early Muslims would never invent a story that humiliates their own prophet, meaning the incident must have happened. Classical scholars view this assumption as historically naive because it ignores the documented socio-political reality of the 8th century Islamic empire. The early centuries of Islam saw the proliferation of the Zanadiqa, ideological heretics. These were hostile actors who nominally converted to infiltrate scholarly ranks, deliberately fabricating texts designed to undermine Islamic doctrine from the inside. Simultaneously, the empire was filled with the Qusas, sensationalist street preachers and storytellers. They prioritized dramatic, emotionally gripping folklore over historical truth, manufacturing tales of satanic interference to draw crowds and earn money in the bazaars. The criterion of embarrassment fails because the actual architects of this story were never embarrassed by it. They were actively weaponizing theology or monetizing dramatic fiction. This leaves one final question. If the Satanic Verses were never recited, why is it recorded that the polytheist Quraysh actually did prostrate alongside the Muslims at the Kaaba that day? The authentic, unbroken historical record from Sahih Al-Bukhari documents the exact event. The Prophet recited Surah An-Najm in its entirety, and the crowd bowed. There is no mention of interpolated pagan verses in the authentic chain. Classical scholars identify the cause of the prostration as iyaz al-Quran, the documented linguistic and rhetorical impact of the text on its poetry-obsessed 7th century audience. The Meccan pagans prided themselves on their mastery of Arabic eloquence. When the Prophet reached the apocalyptic climax of Surah An-Najm, detailing the destruction of ancient nations, the acoustic and rhythmic power of the recitation induced an involuntary psychological reaction of terror. When the chapter concluded with a divine command to drop to the floor, the sheer rhetorical force of the text momentarily bypassed their conscious defenses. They fell to the ground in a state of linguistic awe. The myth of the Satanic Verses survives today only through the misapplication of secular frameworks. Under the rigorous architecture of classical historiography, the story was scientifically dismantled centuries ago, leaving only the historical truth of a linguistic marvel.